Alright, I thought I'd do a quick book review of a book I just read. The book is The Ethics of Money Production by yeah, Guido Hulsmann. Now, this is a book that I've wanted to read for a long time, and I actually put off buying it because I was so certain that I would eventually buy it that I didn't feel the need to get it right away. The reason I wanted to get it so bad is because I read Guido's book, Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism, the biography on Ludwig von Mises, back when it came out in, I don't know, 2007, 2006. That was a great book, and I highly recommend that book to anybody who wants to learn about Austrian economics and libertarianism in general. Uh, Not only is it a good history book and it introduces all the characters and all the events that took place. It's also a pretty good primer on just Austrian economics in general. He goes through and explains a lot of the theory and why the contributions of Mises, why they're significant. And so, in addition to learning a lot of history, you learn a lot of economics too. And it was a great book. People say it's the best biography they've ever heard of read of an economist. I don't know how many economic biographies there are. I've never read another one, but I've read other biographies, and it was pretty good. And right after I read it, he came out with this book, and I thought, well, obviously I'm going to read it. But I was in college, and I do actually have pretty low time preference, so I waited till I had the money that I could really spend on a couple of them. So read it over the course of a couple days at work. It's not a huge book, not like Last Night of Liberalism. And Hulsmann's a great writer. Like when he writes, he has really good turns of phrase. He can be very clear. In fact, sometimes he's even lucid. Eminently quotable. That I found myself a couple times saying, "Oh, I got to write that whole paragraph down." Of course, I never do. Uh, but he's he can be very concise and very fair. You can tell that when he writes that it's rhetorically sound and it's factually correct, and even though he has a bias, he doesn't make he doesn't cheat the language. I mean, he doesn't use tricks to convince you. Now, one thing that will stand out that's unusual about this book, at least to most people, is that it is very religious much of the time, specifically Catholic. Now, I'm not Catholic, but it didn't bother me. I actually thought it was kind of weird. There's one part where he's discussing the advancements in ethical considerations in terms of money, and at one point he spends a lot of time talking about Oresme, I would say, 15th century bishop, maybe a 14th century bishop in France. But at one point he goes, well, it was left to two agnostic Jews, Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises, to advance, ethical considerations of money. It's interesting. So there's a couple times where he makes a point of pointing out the religious stances of various authors like Gary North and Tom Woods. Uh, it's not what you normally look for in an economics book, but it's all good. Like I found it very interesting. If you definitely have like religious Christian and especially Catholic friends, you probably should get them this book and maybe Tom Woods' The Church and the Market, because it's called The Ethics of Money Production, and it is about the effects of money production, especially of what we have today, of the fiat inflation, and what effects that has on morality of individuals. And it definitely, for its ethics, for its morality, it uses the Christian Catholic version, or of ethics, which is fine. A couple other really interesting historical facts in here. One thing that I had never read before, and he cites Jesus de Soto on this, is that the origins of fractional reserve banking, and one of the possibilities being that in the early modern period, bankers actually perhaps began fractional reserve banking not as an overt attempt to defraud their customers, which is what I had always kind of heard, that banks would just issue additional receipts so they could charge interest on the loans. and that certainly could have been part of it, but he points out that it's also possible that they were worried of confiscation. The monarchs very often, or at least not infrequently, would just come to the bankers and usually not directly confiscate, but say, "Well, you have to give us a loan," and they would take all their gold or silver. And the bankers, not in a position to physically resist this, and even if they were to say hide the gold, they'd likely be tortured or coerced into telling where it was. So what they would do is they would loan all of it out, and that way it would be very difficult to be confiscated. And they could just say, "Well, we don't have the gold; it's been loaned out to 1,000 individuals. So if you want to get it, you can go after them." That's a very interesting historical piece of information that I had never heard before. Another one that I found very valuable was the discussion of the so-called classical gold standard. And I know in contemporary discussion, there's a tendency to just kind of view that before the Fed or before the money, paper money system, that there was a gold standard. And really, the gold standard is something that is actually a relatively new phenomenon. Gold coins have been around for a very long time, but that they were the only or the primary monies in a society was unusual. He points out that basically Britain switched to one in the early 19th century. The United States officially was on a bimetallic standard. However, I think it was in the 1830s they artificially overvalued silver relative to gold, which thanks to Grisham's law, where money that is artificially overvalued by the government is driven off the market by the cheaper money, in this case gold, the United States was on a de facto gold standard. However, countries like Germany and France and pretty much the rest of the world were still using silver. And it wasn't until after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 that France and Germany basically switched to gold. I never really heard the details on that. I basically know nothing about the monetary histories of Germany and France, and only a very little bit about England. So that was very valuable. I learned a lot from that. And in terms of the ethics, definitely that it encouraged that the credit expansion causes people to save less, destroys the family, or at least not necessarily will destroy the family, but it has that tendency. So very worthwhile in that regard. Also, at the end, he makes a point to say, well, there is hope, obviously. It's important to remember that the drive towards fiat paper is not irreversible. In the United States, there have always been proponents for paper money, and it had, in many ways, was a leader in this regard. For instance, as far as we know, the first Western use of unbacked paper currency was in the colonies in Massachusetts Bay. That's in the West. China had done it before. And yet, when the Constitution was ratified, basically, paper notes are basically made illegal. And of course, central banks in the United States were abolished on 2 occasions. So, points that out. Also, in China, again, I always heard China had used paper money. He doesn't go into great detail, but he does say that basically for 500 years, from the 10th to the 15th century, the Chinese government at various times attempted to use paper money. And it was such an abysmal failure that in 1455 they basically abandoned attempting to do that, and they switched to a silver standard. And they were the last country to retain a silver standard. I'm not sure, but I believe all the way up until World War II, or maybe even right after. I know I've read accounts of silver still being used that late. I don't know for sure on the date. But so there was an example of a paper currency reverting. Well, I shouldn't say reverting because that sounds pejorative, but how should I say, returning or ascending to a silver standard as opposed to fiat paper. So good read, quick read, well worth it, and I just thought I'd give a shout out because Hulsmann is a great economist. I would recommend anybody who isn't familiar with him to go onto YouTube and type his name and watch all the videos. He has a number of lectures at the Mises Institute. Also go on Google Video if you do the same on Google Video. There's quite a few lectures he's given in Europe at various seminars there, and they're all very worthwhile watching. And as a monolingual American, I'm always impressed by people who can speak more than one language, and in Guido's case, it's like 5 or 6 languages. Most of them he seems to be able to lecture in and write in very well. So very impressive. When you read, you can almost hear him speaking too. I mean, it's just the prose are very good, especially for his 5th language. So, all right, that's it.